Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Sadu, and today we've got Diana Rodgers on the show. So I'm super pumped to share this episode with you guys. I'm excited because this is sort of the other side of the meat story, the side of the meat story that isn't shared in the mainstream media as much. And I think it's really important to look at multiple sides of an issue, especially when it comes to something this important, like health and the environment. Now, this interview is about 40 minutes or so. We could have talked for 4 hours easy. This topic is huge. But if you're interested, you can always delve deeper. But let's hop in. I hope you enjoy it. Diana, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks, Marcus. I'm so happy to be here.
So for the folks who may not be familiar with your work, can you just give us a little bit of background on yourself and how you got into all of this sustainability stuff to begin with?
Yeah, I'll try to give you the shortest version that makes sense. So in college and high school, I worked on farms as my summer job and really just loved being outside and covered in dirt and involved in growing vegetables. I was not a great vegetable harvester. And so my boss had me working at the farm stand a little bit more than like picking because I would like drop melons and I was just kind of a mess. And then in college, I met my husband, who was an environmentalist and not quite sure what to do with himself. So he became an English major and I was an art major. So that's just kind of an odd couple to get into where we ended up. But we got real jobs. We lived in Portland, Oregon for a little bit, and we were working in sort of the high tech boom that was happening then. And he in particular was miserable. Like, I thought it was kind of fun working in an ad agency, but he actually hated every second of market research and making money for all these high-tech companies. And he was just like, I want to be outside. I don't want to be in a cubicle. This is awful. And so he read a book called by an author called Wendell Berry. And the book was The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture. And that changed his life. So it was like me reading The Paleo Solution. It just, really set him on a whole new trajectory. And so he decided to quit his job, go back to school for a master's in soil science, and get a job on a farm to learn how to drive a tractor and all the practical things you need to know. And so for the last 18 years, we've been living on an organic farm. And we sort of incorporated animals into the mix as part of the fertility cycle, because we realized that you actually can't grow vegetables unless you have animals as part of your system. So you're either like going to get manure from a horse farm or buy bone meal and blood meal and feather meal from, other places in bags, or you can actually just have the animals right on your farm. So that's the farming end of it. And then I also had a health journey, that kind of went along with this, where I found out actually, I guess when I was 26, that I had celiac disease, which answered a lot of issues that I had when I was growing up, being very sick as a kid. And but going gluten-free helped, but it didn't help all the way. And it wasn't really until I went paleo that all my blood sugar issues were fixed and my guts really got much better. And so I decided to go back to school to become a dietitian. And now I have a nutrition practice, and, because of that in my life on the farm and all this talk lately about sustainable diets and the focus on a vegetarian or vegan diet as being the best for sustainability and, some people think for health, I thought that I might offer a completely different perspective to that based on everything I've noticed on the farm and through my nutrition practice, just upping people's intake of protein and that sort of solving, issues with weight loss and blood sugar regulation and gut stuff. I mean, it's just really great when you increase someone's protein, and almost no one comes to me eating an optimal amount. And so a few years ago, I decided to write a book and really focused on sustainability and diet and how those two, like this ancestral template that a lot of people in the paleo keto world sort of apply to nutrition, and also then apply it to agriculture. And it's the same exact idea. It's the same worldview. It's like, we should be eating what we ate before the agricultural revolution, and we should also be farming how we farmed basically before the agricultural revolution, and really looking at grazing animals as one of our best tools to mitigate climate change. There's so much misinformation, as you know, nutritionally about meat causing cancer and diabetes and obesity, but the same can be said for all of the vilification environmentally of animals. I'm not a huge believer in industrial confinement raising, but I do think that animals, especially grazing animals, are absolutely critical. I mean, especially in a place like Canada, right, where you just can't grow lettuce all year round. The traditional diets of the people there are largely meat-based, and there's a reason for that. And so, I have an easy sell in places like Canada because it just makes more sense to folks there. So that's in a nutshell. So I've got this film and a book. The film kind of grew out of my desire to reach more young people who wouldn't likely pick up a heavy book that was full of science. And so, these plant-based documentaries that are basically propaganda are being shown in schools here in the U.S. As like part of science class. And it's really disturbing. I see a lot of nutrition cases of young people getting very sick by not eating well and falling prey to a lot of this misinformation that's being perpetuated by the animal rights movement. And so I wanted to offer them a version of this story that was easily digestible. It was told in a media format that they're very comfortable learning from.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I think that's a big reason why I was so attracted to your message, in the sense that you are living this. You're a dietitian. You also have your own organic farm that you're running. Like, you are getting your hands dirty. You're walking the talk. So I think that really lends itself for you as far as people listening to what you're saying, because you're really practicing this stuff.
Yeah, and I don't use my platform too much to like sell folks stuff. I'm very careful about who I partner with. I only partner with companies that I really, really believe in, and I try to be as authentic and truthful as I can with all my messaging.
Yeah, that's great. Now, right out of the gate, let's just get this one out of the way, because I need to know, will eating meat give me cancer, diabetes, and make me an all-around shitty person?
So there's a lot of misinformation. And I found that even people who are sold on eating meat have cut down on their meat eating because they're worried about it. And they've been hearing, meat's going to give you cancer or heart disease and all these other things. But when you really look at the research, this is all based on population studies, just observational studies where they take food journals from people, where they've asked them, how much meat did you eat in the last 18 months? Things like that are known to be inaccurate. People lie. They're much more likely to report what they think is healthy food, and much more likely to say that they exercise more than they do, less likely to remember that they smoke and drink, things like that. And so when you do compare the average vegetarian to the average omnivore, and don't factor in all these different lifestyle factors that a typical vegetarian has, like, a typical vegetarian is more likely maybe to do yoga, drink less, all these healthy things, eat more fruits and vegetables, which is a good thing, compared to your typical omnivore, which, might be following a standard Western diet, eating a lot of processed foods, maybe not exercising as much as a typical vegetarian. You're going to see a bump in health in the vegetarian population, but they have done studies where they've adjusted for all those lifestyle factors, and they found absolutely no difference at all in longevity between vegetarians and meat eaters. They've also done studies looking at health food shoppers, so people that shop at health food stores. And so in that population, you're looking at similar lifestyles. So people that shop at health food stores tend to be healthier than the general population. And again, they found no difference at all in longevity between people who eat meat and people who don't.
Right. So as far as the longevity goes, when you sort of equal out and balance everything out, there's no difference. Some folks, think that we should do away with meat altogether because, quote unquote, we can get all the protein and nutrients we need from plants, so why not? How do you typically unpack that statement?
So I admit that there does seem to be some people that do very well with minimal or no meat in their diet. However, I think for most people, you can only benefit from the additional nutrients you can get from meat in a whole food form. So taking supplements is not the same as eating food in its real form. We know this because, for example, vegan B12 supplements actually increase your need for B12. They're not a solution for a B12 deficiency. We know that, there was a case of a mom who was vegan. She was taking B12 supplements. She was exclusively breastfeeding her baby, and it had permanent neurological damage, permanent brain damage from a B12 deficiency, even though she was taking the supplements. And
Wow.
so I get very nervous as a mother and as a dietitian. I think it's fine for an adult to experiment, a healthy adult, maybe you can get away with it. There's a lot of genetic factors that come into play and a lot of, gut health factors. I'm somebody who can't really eat a raw kale salad. It's just, years of celiac have really trashed my intestinal health. And so when I eat vegetables, they generally have to be cooked. But, some people are just, they're born with, a really good set of genes that allows them to convert things like beta carotene into retinol, which almost half the population can't do very well. And so there's just a lot of factors at play on whether or not someone might do better or worse on a plant-based or vegan type diet. But I'd say, when we want to factor in sustainability, when we want to factor in the risks that you could pose to a young person of potential nutrient deficiencies during that critical time of growth. So, their need for B12 and iron is really high. Their need for high quality protein is really high at that time. And meat provides, the best, most absorbable form of iron. You would have to eat pounds and pounds of kale or spinach, rather, to get the same iron that you can get in a small piece of meat. And anyone who's a parent knows how much kids love spinach and how hard it is to actually get them to sit down and eat large amounts of things like spinach. And so I just think it can be very risky to put a child who is an omnivore on a diet that's not evolutionarily appropriate for humans.
Yeah, that's a great point as far as we are built to be omnivores. Now, as far as supplementing with B12 and that increasing your need for B12, do we know what the mechanism at play there is?
Because these vegan B12 supplements are actually not actual B12. They're B12 analogs, and so they're not seen by the body in the same way. And supplementation can be very helpful for some people with nutrient deficiencies or insufficiencies, but it can also be very dangerous because it's not very well regulated. You don't really know what's in these supplements, and it's just always a good idea to try to get your nutrients directly from food, because that's just how animals are designed to get their nutrients. And there's a lot of synergistic effects happening when you eat food eat nutrients from a whole food form instead of in isolation.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny specifically on the protein front because everyone seems to be in 100% agreement that there are higher and lower quality sources of fats and carbohydrates, but then some of the same folks argue that that doesn't apply to protein, which is sort of odd logic. I haven't quite wrapped my head around that one, but...
Yeah, and we even have vegan special interest groups that are trying to change the protein bioavailability score with the government here and putting beef at the bottom, even though beef is closer to the top with eggs. And that's based on ideological bias against red meat. And so it's very, very dangerous to be rewriting biology and rewriting textbooks based on a religious-like views on a food source.
Now, what are your thoughts on the nutritional properties of products like Beyond Burger and potentially down the road, things like lab-grown meat?
Mm-hmm. Nutritionally, we don't have a lot of information. We do know that the nutrients that are listed on the label, a lot of them are just fortified. So you might as well just be eating like a chunk of tofu and then, chugging it down with a bunch of pills after that. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. So these nutrients are not provided in the real whole food form. And so even though it may say the same grams of protein or the same, grams of iron, for example, on the package, that doesn't necessarily mean your body is going to see it the same way. So it's kind of trickery.
Yeah, totally. Now, how about the environmental aspects of lab-grown meat or using growing methods like hydroponics? And maybe you could explain what hydroponics are as well for us.
Yeah, so hydroponics is when you grow plants in a water solution. And so a lot of people say, well, what's wrong with that? That seems like a great thing. And especially for people that don't live, close to where plants can grow, this could be great. But a lot of these hydroponic situations are relying on, you have to get the inputs somewhere. These plants need to eat. And so we have to mine minerals in order to feed them to the plant. So you have to get it. They're basically it's like critical care for lettuce is how I like to.
I like that.
And so when you can grow it outdoors in soil, that's always going to be better than growing it indoors in a water chemical solution under fluorescent lights. So we should be trying to capture solar energy as much as possible and just converting that into plants, which we can eat directly, or into grass, which we can't eat directly, but animals like cattle can. And as far as the lab meat goes, that's even worse because a lot of people are really taken in by how magical it can be, and they're not realizing all of the inputs that are required in order to make this lab meat and how expensive that is from an energy perspective. And so I don't know why someone would want to, take a bunch of monocrop agriculture that's grown in a pretty destructive way and then use all these high energy processes in a lab, which is, temperature controlled. You've got all these people in plastic suits that need to handle everything because at these labs, there's a good temperature and good atmosphere for growing meat, but it's also a good temperature for growing bacteria too, right? So no one's talking about all the antibiotics that are required to keep this lab meat clean. And when we look at the alternatives, which is, well-grazed animals, so it's not like CAFO horrible slaughter meat versus clean lab meat. It's not black and white like that. There's another solution, which is regenerative agriculture. And that's what we argue for in the book is a system of agriculture that actually improves soil health. It's something that will be here if we wanted to come back in 1,000 years and still have humanity here. That's how it's going to happen with regenerative agriculture, not with lab meat and Beyond Burgers.
Yeah, those are great points. I find the whole elimination of animals from our food system and lab-grown meat sort of similar to the biohacking crowd because there seems to be a bunch of, it's either arrogance or ignorance built into both perspectives. So, for example, the biohacking folks think that they can somehow trick their physiology with drugs and specific therapies. And then the lab-grown meat folks think that they can do just as good a job as nature. And where do you think this stems from? Like, is it an underappreciation of nature and its complexity, or is it just our narcissism shining through? Like, what do you think's going on here?
Well, it's all those things. It's narcissism, it's hubris, and it's I think also a fear of death. I see that a lot in the health community with longevity and biohacking. It's like none of us are gonna escape death. It's gonna happen, and you need death in order to have more life. And so, there's no escaping it. And I think, Silicon Valley is. They want to live forever. They want to go to Mars. It would make so much more sense to just colonize Antarctica than to go to Mars. But we want to go to Mars because that's the little boy dream that they all had. And there's a lot of money behind going to Mars, behind the ultimate longevity, living to 300. There's, and the promise of lab meat, of no animal suffering, when that is actually impossible. It's just not possible. Tons and tons and tons of death has to happen in order for lab meat to happen. So in order to clear a field, in order to grow your corn or your wheat or your soy or whatever you're going to use as your input for lab meat, it has to be one of those things grown in a pretty destructive way. You have to annihilate an entire ecosystem in order to make way for these fields of one crop. And then you have to roll in with the tractors. You have to plow up, so you're destroying all the soil life underneath the surface, which we're just learning more and more about now. Then you're applying all kinds of fossil fuel chemical inputs to make sure that nothing but that one plant can grow. So you're killing pollinators, you're killing anything else that could possibly grow in that field. When you look at regenerative agriculture, you're actually doing the opposite. You're inviting as much life as possible. You want as biodiverse a system, as many different plants and as many different insects and birds and fish and trees. I mean, you want as much life as possible because that's going to be a more resilient ecosystem. And that's the healthiest ecosystems in the world are the ones that have the most diverse life.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, according to the EPA, all livestock is responsible for 3.9% of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., with 2% coming from cattle specifically, and then agriculture crops clock in at 4.7%. And then just to sort of put this into perspective, transportation, electricity generation, and industry are responsible for a combined 78.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So my question is, how do you think this environmental piece of the meat puzzle gained so much traction when the statistics just aren't overly supportive of that narrative? How did we get here?
Well, there was a report that came out, and we talk about this in the book, called Livestock's Long Shadow. And what they did was a real trickery when it came to the methodology of the research. And so they looked at the entire life cycle of a cow. It's called Lifecycle analysis. And so they looked at everything that's required to grow the feed, to transport the animals, to process the animals, to get them to the stores. So there's a lot of different components to that. And they came up with a number of 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions on a worldwide level. But then when they looked at transportation and conveniently left out a lot of other things like commercial and energy generation. So they looked at just transportation, but they only looked at tailpipe emissions. So just what's coming out of the back of the plane or of the car. So they didn't look at any of the energy required to mine the metals, to build the car, to ship those cars from, Japan to the U.S. or Canada. They didn't look at any of that stuff. They just looked at what is being burned in terms of fossil fuels when you actually drive the car, which is 14%. So when you look at just tailpipe emissions, so if you were to look at for cows what they're belching, so it's not actually cow farts, it's belching from the ruminant process. That's only 5% worldwide of greenhouse gas emissions compared to 14%. But in the previous scenario where they were saying 14.5%. The media loved that because then they were saying that, livestock is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transportation sector. And so the media just loves glomming on to things like that. The plant-based community loves statistics like that and twisting things. And so the number's a little higher worldwide only because compared to the U.S. where it's only 2%, in a lot of other countries where they have less industry, less fossil fuels from transportation, for example, where cars outnumber people, like in Brazil or in places like India where there's a lot of cows walking around that actually aren't even being used for food. They're just
sacred there, yeah.
Sacred cows, yeah. So and actually there's huge issues going on in India right now with people being killed for even being rumored to have meat in their homes. So that's a whole nother issue that we actually address in the film too. But So in some other countries, cattle are a larger percentage compared to transportation because they just don't have as much transportation happening as we do in the U.S.
Got it.
Yeah.
Now, how about the land question? So if we were to just remove cattle and livestock altogether, could we just not produce more crops and feed the planet that way? That's a common argument that we hear.
Yeah, and this is the biggest takeaway I hope people get, and it's what won me my contract with my book publisher, who is a vegan publisher, and they actually are the publisher of the China study. So the idea that you can just take cattle off land and just plow it up for more potatoes or carrots or apple trees is completely false. So what people don't understand is that most agricultural land is not suitable for cropping because it's either too cold, too hot, too dry, too rocky, too hilly, or there's not adequate rainfall or irrigation options for good crop growth. And so most of our agricultural land that we have in the world is really just only usable for grazing animals like cattle and goats and sheep and camels and, all the other animals that actually can convert these very fibrous grasses and shrubbery into protein. And so if we were to remove ruminant animals from our food system, we would actually just have a gaping hole in our food system and of the highest quality, most nutrient dense food in our food system. So it would be a huge tragedy if we went down that line of just killing all the ruminant animals and just thinking that we could survive on just cropping alone.
Right. You mentioned rainfalls. I've noticed that you differentiate between green, blue, and gray water, which I think is super important. So can you just explain the whole water-beef relationship for us?
Sure. So there's some memes on the internet saying that, your quarter-pound burger was 10 bathtubs full of water, wasted water, right? That's not actually true. So there's different ways of measuring water. There's green water, which is rainfall that would have come down anyway. So it's like saying by standing in the parking lot, I'm wasting 10 gallons of water just because it's raining in the parking lot where I'm standing, right? And then there's blue water, which is aquifers and lakes and irrigation that you are actually utilizing to grow something. And then the gray water is wastewater. And so when you look at the water that you need in order to produce a pound of beef, most of that water, even in feedlot finished beef, is green water. So in feedlot finished beef, 94% of the water footprint for that meat production is green water. And in grass-fed beef, it's 97% green water. So that's just water that's already in the grass, that's coming down from the clouds. I mean, that's just naturally occurring water, whether or not that animal was there or not. The blue water footprint is very, very small. And if you were to compare the blue water footprint, so what you need to actually, what would be, quote unquote, wasted, beef is actually more efficient than a lot of other foods that we eat, like avocados, rice, sugar, and walnuts. And so we just have to be very careful about what kind of water are we talking about when we're attributing water to beef.
Yeah, totally. And I think that that's also a case for healthier soil, because if I'm understanding it correctly, healthier soil can actually absorb more rainwater and use it. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And we actually have a really cool example of this in the film where we do a rainfall simulation real time up at Michigan State, and we make it rain on bare dirt versus a pasture type piece of land. And you can see on the just plain dirt that the water doesn't actually penetrate that dirt. It just sort of runs off. And in a cropping situation, that's also taking not only topsoil with it, but it's also taking all the chemicals and, pesticides and herbicides and all of that into our waterways, and that's what creates dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. In well-managed grazing situations, the water actually goes into the roots and stays in the soil. So it's not so much the water that you get, it's the water that you keep. And we also have a great example of this in the film where we visit Chihuahua, Mexico, with a rancher that only gets about 10 inches of water per year. And he is turning this desert back into what looks like the Serengeti, just with cattle walking around, pooping, adding more moisture to the soil, adding more carbon to the soil, which attracts water molecules, and actually improving the land, improving habitat for birds. He's working with bird organizations because these rare birds are actually coming back and stopping at his farm in Mexico on their way during their migration, where they didn't have the proper habitat before to be able to make that trip. And so what we need is more regenerative type agriculture that actually improves, biodiversity, water holding capacity of the soil, and just overall life.
Wow, that's super cool. So moving on to ethics, this is a tougher one because unlike nutrition and the environment, where we can look at objective markers and statistics, with ethics we can't. So how do you go about even approaching this part of the puzzle?
So I don't think that you can really have a proper ethical debate without understanding food production and nutrition. And so that's why we did those two chapters first, because you can't just say, well, it's bad to kill animals if you don't understand that a vegan type diet could actually potentially kill more animals than just eating one large ruminant, which can provide almost 500 pounds of meat, versus a diet completely based on, industrial agriculture, which annihilates ecosystems and destroys soil health. We also have to look at this from a food sovereignty perspective and being very sensitive to people who have always had meat in their culture, telling them that they're wrong. And so we actually say from a social justice perspective that, forcing a vegan diet on people who may not have the luxury of pushing away a nutrient-dense food, who may need that nutrient-dense food, who might live in an area where only grazing animals thrive, which is a lot of the world. There's also places in the world where women can't own land, but they can own livestock. And so if we take livestock away from them, what happens to their families? What happens to the nutrient status of their children? What happens in these areas where, the land is too brittle and too dry to plant GMO corn. They don't have the irrigation. They don't have the fertilizer. They don't own the land in order to be able to do that. Or one horrible weather event might destroy cropping. Cropping is actually extremely delicate because in a lot of places, one monsoon and that's it. You're done. You've lost your whole crop. In the U.S., we have crop subsidies that protect farmers, but they don't have that everywhere. And so we have to just be very careful about understanding that even debating whether or not we should eat meat comes from a position of privilege. It's fine if you want to do that for yourself, but then to dictate that everybody else follow your ethics and your morals just because you're uncomfortable with the idea that animals die is absolutely wrong.
I think one of the really important points that I want to double click on is the resiliency of having a regenerative system versus just say one crop in one specific area. So for example, if you had a stool with, 10 legs on it and you remove one, it's still much, much sturdier than if you have a stool with 2 legs and you remove one and you're screwed. So I think that regenerative piece and it being more resilient to potential downfall, I guess, like in the case of a monsoon or whatever it may be, that's just such an important point as far as keeping a robust system up and running.
Yeah, and what we want is more regional solutions, not more centralized solutions. And what we've seen in the U.S. from, coronavirus is major fractures because we only have a handful of meat companies controlling our meat system for most people here. And so when one plant shuts down, that has huge effects. Like we're still, when I go to the grocery store, they're rationing meat. And that's a huge problem. But yet on the farm where I live, we're completely sold out for 2020. We've never seen more interest from vegetables and from meat on our farm. And all the farmers I know who sell direct to consumers are seeing the same thing. And so what we need is more smaller and medium size farm businesses and just businesses in general. I mean, this applies to everything. What we don't want is monopolies and only large corporations that then can take over. What we need is robust, small and mid-sized companies that are much more agile and able to, change.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a point of saying that you're not just for meat, you're specifically an advocate for better meat. So how can you just expand a little bit? How would an ideal situation look as far as getting away from that conventional system and moving towards a more sustainable one?
Well, so we can't do it tomorrow, and there's a lot of people, unfortunately, due to our the way our agriculture system is set up, that it shouldn't be that a Twinkie is less expensive than an apple, right? There's something wrong with that, and I still think for the folks who maybe don't have access to better meat, but want to feed their kids an optimal diet, they should go ahead and feed their kids meat. And I still think that beef is a better choice than chicken or pork if we're just looking at conventional stuff. But I think that, I did go through feeding the world. That always comes up. How are you going to feed the world this way? I did go through all the acreage in the United States and what is underutilized, what is currently being used for ethanol production, which doesn't make any sense at all. And a lot of private property and just conservation land that is currently not being grazed that could be grazed. And so if we're looking at just finishing the cattle that we have on grass instead of in feedlots, because all cattle start on grass, it's just whether or not they're finished on a feedlot or finished on grass, we do have the ability to finish on grass. But that being said, also, there are good systems that do feed some grain to their animals in a good way. And also cattle can upcycle nutrients that have or foods that have no other use in our food system. So they can graze a harvested field of corn and actually eat all those corn stalks, fertilize the land, and then turn corn stalks into protein. So there's a lot of really creative ways. It doesn't have to be 100% grass-fed, regenerative. There's still better ways and worse ways to be raising animals, and I think we need to explore all of those options.
Yeah, that's interesting too from a nutritional standpoint. You mentioned going with beef over chicken, and in the instance of potentially causing the least harm or suffering, in my mind, it makes sense to eat beef in that instance as well over chicken because a cow provides so much more meat and you're only killing one animal. But it's interesting because I've met a bunch of vegetarians over the years, and in my experience, most of them are quicker to eliminate beef, and if they were to eat some meat, they'd make it chicken. So have you noticed that same tendency? Or fish.
Yeah, and the reality is there's no, at least in the U.S., there's no humane handling laws for seafood or for poultry. So there are for large animals, and so that needs to be a consideration, how the animal died for you. Additionally, pigs and chicken in an industrial system eat 100% grain, where cattle don't. Only about 12% or so of their diet overall comes from grain. And then also, even if you look at a conventionally finished, cow on a feedlot, they're only on a feedlot for about 3 months or so. And during that time, they're not in cages, unable to move, where in pork production or chicken production, it is a much worse environment for their entire life. And so I think nutritionally, beef is about 30% more nutrient dense than chicken. And then we've got the environmental aspect where cattle can actually upcycle crop residue like corn stalks from the ethanol industry into protein, things that would decompose and emit greenhouse gases if we didn't run it through a cow and turn it into protein. And then we have the ethical case too, where one large animal like a cow is almost 500 pounds of meat. How many chickens would you need to kill, or how many salmon would you need to kill for that?
How does the average sort of life cycle look for a cow or a ruminant? Because I think that we see all of these memes circulated online, and it paints a different picture.
Right. So the mama cows are out on pasture. They have their babies. The babies stay with their moms in a beef cow situation. It's different in dairy, of course, with the veal industry. But in a beef cattle situation, the babies stay with their moms. And then then become stockers and eat more grass. And then they're either finished on a feedlot or finished on grass. And so the feedlot, it's not necessarily indoors. It might just be covered or it might be open. So it's not like they're going into a factory necessarily. And so again, it's the last portion of their life, and it's actually. I don't see it as black and white necessarily. There are better and worse feedlots. I've been to some that are really nice. And there's not this horrible smell, and there's not animals screaming the whole time like what we see in a lot of these vegan documentaries. It's they're just hanging out, getting fat, eating some grain, and then, and that's it. So it's very, very different than conventional poultry or conventional pork, which is really horrific to see in real life.
Okay, gotcha. And then how would that conventional ruminant situation look compared to a regenerative grazing situation, for example?
Yeah, so just because a cow is grass-fed doesn't mean that it's necessarily regenerative. So there's a couple different ways, and we have a really great animation in the film that explains this difference really quickly. So you can either have your animals on the same piece of pasture for the entire season, or you can be moving them constantly in smaller sections. But so it's the same amount of land, but you just break it up into smaller sections and you rotate them around. And so the problem with continuous grazing, where they're on the same piece of land for, let's say, the whole summer, is that these animals are then overgrazing their favorite patches of grass, undergrazing maybe the thistle or the other plants that they don't like as very, very much. And so that ends up making the plants that they really like die because they're overgrazed so that, it kills the roots. Also, parasites can take over. So if one animal has worms, then all the animals get worms, and it's just a big mess. So you end up with overgrazed areas and undergrazed areas. In a regenerative system where you're moving them frequently, so some people call this holistic management or mob grazing, you're actually breaking up a large field into many, many different smaller paddocks, and you're moving them. Sometimes it's several times a day. Other times it's, once every few days. But that actually allows the animals to intensively graze one area. They graze all of it. So the thistle, the buckthorn, everything gets grazed evenly. And then they're quickly moved off. And moving them off allows that patch of grass or that field a chance to recover properly. And that's how you build soil health and sequester carbon is during that rest period.
Before we get to where folks can find out more about you, the book, the film, is there anything that we didn't touch on today that you'd like to mention to my listeners?
Sure. So, the book is available for pre-order right now. And for folks who do pre-order it, we have some really cool bonuses that we're offering, including interviews that we didn't put in the film. So 7 interviews that didn't make it into the film just because I shot so many. And we're also giving away a bonus chapter of the book, a cookbook, and also a preview link to the film. So if folks pre-order the book, we're actually going to send them the film when it's ready, and they'll get to see it before everybody else. So that's pretty cool. We've also created a course called Meat Curious for folks that are maybe ex-vegetarian or vegan, or they've cut down on their meat and they're just really worried about it. Rob and I created a 9-module course that actually walks you through all of this. So basically it's like 9 podcasts all together, one only on ethics, one only on the environment, with really nice slides that explain it to you in a really easy way. So so that's something that we'll also have up on, everyone can find that at sacredcow.info. And then they can also follow me on Instagram at Sustainable Dish.
Amazing. I will link to all that stuff in the show notes, and thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Diana Rodgers. If you're interested in delving a little deeper on this topic, I would highly recommend the book Sacred Cow. I read it, I learned a ton, and if you're not super keen on reading, the film should be out soon as well. Now, if you're interested in personalized one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can head over to the website at n1fitness.com/coaching. Or feel free to click the link in the show notes below. Also follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness and on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. Thanks for listening, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya!